and you're listening to Teacher Talk, an ETT Podcast production.
Welcome to Teacher Talk, an ETT podcast. I'm your host for this episode. My name is Pav Wander. I'm an elementary school teacher. We are talking today about the important role of the teacher librarian in a school community. And I am joined here by two incredible educators who I've had the pleasure of working with and getting to know better, who have that experience of working in the library learning commons space and do so much for the library. And this is an area I think that we've seen slow cuts happening in the school community for several years now, and I think that that is just a huge detriment to the school community. So I'm very excited to speak to these two educators, Christie and Rabia. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's start off by hearing a little bit more about you. Please introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit more about your learning experiences, your experiences in education that have brought you into the library space and have kept you in that sort of reading space, that literacy space, or that learning commons space that has been expanding so much over the past few years. Christy, I'm going to start with you. Please tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you've ended up in the library learning commons.
Okay, so I didn't really start out as librarian thinking that was where I was going to end up. I actually started teaching secondary school in England, and I was teaching psychology and sociology there. And then I came back to Ontario and quickly realized at the time that there were no jobs in the secondary panel, and decided, okay, well, maybe I'll give the elementary panel a try. So I got my junior qualification. I got my primary qualification. I did a couple LTOs, and mostly intermediate, and then I ended up in kindergarten. And it was a very different world, but it was absolutely phenomenal, and I learned so much there. And one of the things I absolutely adored was the kindergarten program because I loved the inquiry-based approach. I learned so much from working from the students' interests and really learning about literacy and building it in that way. And that really, I think, is what sparked a lot of it for me. And then the ability to go into the library came up, and I thought, well, actually, I think I'd really, really enjoy this. I really love working with tech. I love finding different ways to encourage that side of teaching and learning. And so that was something that I felt I could really develop and run with in the Learning Commons, as well as a joy of learning and reading and inquiry. So that's kind of what brought me there. A little bit of a roundabout way.
Yeah. And, as we've talked to so many educators on Teacher Talk over the past couple of episodes, we've learned so much about the journeys that have brought teachers to their current teaching situations. And we know that, they're not static. They're not going to stay, teaching in the library or teaching grade 7 or 8 or kindergarten for long periods of time. But it's really incredible to hear the amount of learning and the journeys that teachers have gone through to get to where they are. And they bring all of that wealth of knowledge with them into their current roles, which I think is such a beautiful thing. And Christy, you mentioned that you learned so much from being in the kindergarten space about inquiry-based learning and just a different way to run the program. And so many of those things we pull into other teaching experiences that we have. And I think that there's so much to learn from every space that we are in, and they can those things can benefit the students that we have in front of us in so many different ways. So thank you for sharing a little bit about your journey, Christy. Rabia, tell us a little bit more about you and tell us about what experiences you have in teaching and the work that you have done around library and literacy and reading and that love of reading, which I know that you have.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm Rabia. So currently I'm a special education resource teacher. and I work with students from kindergarten to grade 5. But previously, I've done like lots of different roles all over the city. Like I've been a teacher librarian, an ESL homeroom teacher, ESL itinerant teacher. So I've had like lots of different roles. And I think it's really interesting to think about how I kind of got into library. I think initially I got really interested in like libraries and school libraries because I took the teacher librarian AQ. I took that AQ because I just really loved books and I really loved like reading. So I wanted to sort of explore what this like teacher librarian space is all about, because for me it was sort of like magical. Like it just didn't feel like such a cool space could like exist. So I was like really interested in learning more about it. So I did the AQ and I kind of went in with like a love of reading, like a love for culturally responsive books. I think partly because of my own like lived experience of loving books, but never really seeing myself reflected in books. And so that like love and that passion to have like all students like reflected and represented is something that I initially went into. And so I finished the AQ and then I was very like lucky to get an LTO position as a teacher librarian. And I think doing the position really helped me see that like the teacher librarian role is about books, but it's also about like so much more. And I think what I discovered was this like beautiful space is a space that all students like use in a school community. And the teacher librarian is really like a leader in that space. And I think they're like an equity leader because they can really like push out, or they can really like model a lot of like this really great work that we want to happen, like in terms of like inclusive books, representation, like multimodal ways of like learning, technology, collaboration. So I sort of just like fell in love with the role because I felt like it combined like my love for equity and my love for books, and like it just like merged my two passions together. And so I had like a really great opportunity to just, do that LTO and really like learn about what, this position is actually about. And I'm not in the position, like I'm not in a teacher librarian at the moment, but what I am learning is that even though I'm not in the role, like I still have like a teacher librarian mindset that I'm taking into like every opportunity that I have now, like whether it's like special education. I sort of think like a teacher librarian, and I just sort of I see every like I guess opportunity in that lens. And so I feel like even though I'm not like in the space, like teacher librarianship is central to like my identity personally as well as professionally. And so I'm really like advocating for school libraries because I think they really benefit all students. And so I guess those are some of the ways that I come to the library space.
Thank you, Rabia. Yeah, you highlighted some important points that I think tie very much into what we see evolving and happening in the library learning commons space, especially when it comes to the culturally responsive text. And I think that the way that I have gotten to know you, Rabia, is you are a huge promoter of those culturally relevant texts, and you are sharing constantly different books and really sharing that love of reading that you have with the students, and that reading that you've shared with so many students in your various roles. I think that it is very important to highlight that as a teacher librarian, you do, as you highlighted, you see so many different classroom spaces, you have exposure to different modes of teaching, you see kind of the entire school from a very unique lens. And you have the privilege and the ability to really cater to every space out of this incredible space that you have set up, and the amount of learning that can be provided from there. So I think those are some important points that we bring to the conversation: the importance of the evolution of texts, and how we can connect those texts to the lived experience that students have, and the diversity of students that we have in our learning spaces, and how teacher librarians are really the impact makers of all of those resources that are in a school, and getting those resources out to teachers in a variety of different ways, I think is such an important piece. And then there's also, of course, this connection to literacy, and I want to talk a little bit more about literacy and more specifically reading. Over the past year, we have a new a right to read report that has been brought out by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and this report highlights a real need for a focus on reading and science of reading, and moving away from some of the ways that we have been teaching reading over the last 10 or 15 years, and really bringing it back to, how are students learning how to read, and doing so effectively. And how I'd love to hear from the both of you to know about what role do you think that the teacher librarian plays in that love of reading. We've talked a little bit about it already, but I'd love to know how your work, because we didn't really hear or see much about it in the Right to Read report, the role of the teacher librarian or the role of the learning commons space. So in your own opinion, in your own experiences, in the work that you do or have done in the library learning commons space, what is the connection there to the science of reading, the love of reading, the joy of reading, and the effectiveness of teaching reading in school communities through the learning commons space? Rabia, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think it's foundational. I think if we want this like report, or if we want any sort of like theoretical stuff to become practical in like the lived experience of like schooling, I think the school library learning commons and the teacher librarian like needs to be centered in this work, because I think at the heart of like teacher librarianship, obviously teacher librarianship is like multifaceted, but I think at the heart of it is like, you're an advocate for literacy, and you're an advocate for like multimodal or um I can't remember the word. Is it like multimodal, like ways of literacy? Like, you're kind of like a promoter and an advocate for that. And so I feel like if we want this report to kind of like be practical in a contextual way in, different parts of different schools, like those spaces that are like the heart of the school community need to be centered. And I say this because I think the teacher librarian curates like a space that's like the school library, but they also curate like the collection. Like it's not a random collection, but it's very intentional based on, the school community, the context, the lived experiences. Um, Teacher librarians are very aware of like how to affirm and expand identities in a school community. And I think that is like the heart of like promoting a love of reading, because like if you can see yourself and if you can see other folks who look like you, who might be different from you in books, in text, then you're going to feel like engaged to read and to learn more. So I feel like that intentional curation is actually promoting like a love of reading, and I think a love of reading is like foundational to like building then the skills, like the fundamental skills of like learning how to read. So I feel like that's like really central. I also think we talked about this before, but like the teacher librarian kind of gets to serve all students in a school community, and they can kind of see a different perspective or like a different side of students, which I think is foundational in building a love of reading, because that's the way we can build rapport, relationship. We can understand students' interests, and we can kind of then reflect that in our collection. And I think when we take the time to do those like intentional things, students feel like a sense of like belonging. They feel like their voice matters. They feel like they're heard. And I feel like all of those like things are like part of building like a love of reading. And I think that's why it's very important to have like a teacher librarian in the space. And like it's the space is not just about like checking books out or just getting the books. I think it's the teacher librarian who shows how those books can be used. It's the teacher librarian that like connects the books with the kids or the community or the school or the teacher. So I feel like for any like theory to come into practice, the teacher librarian and the school library learning commons, which is really like the biggest classroom, and the teacher librarian is kind of like an instructional leader in a school. I think they need to be centered in any of this like literacy learning.
100% I agree with you, Rabia. I think you hit the nail on the head right at the end there, that the teacher librarian in the space is really an instructional leader because
Mhm.
of what they have access to. And you touched on the intentional curation, and I really like that term because that's essentially what it is. And it's not just the books, it's also the
Mhm.
ways that the books are being spread out to different parts of the school, different communities. Every teacher librarian that I have ever met knows exactly what types of books every kid is going to be interested in or is going to
Mhm.
love. Oh, I have a book for you. I think you're going to
Mhm.
love this one. I just got this book in for you and I think it's going to be great for you. They get to know the students so well and really foster that sense of belonging, which of course we know is huge in fostering joy. And without
Mhm.
joy, there isn't going to be any engagement. There isn't going to be any meaningful learning. And so that is something that we really need to push and foster as well. So thank you, Rabia, for those insights. Rabia also mentioned multimodal ways of getting that information out to students and multimodal access points. And Christie, I know that you are incredible in this area. I've seen the library space that you have helped to sort of put together and to continue to build upon. And I had the pleasure to work with you in that space for a brief period of time, but for a lovely period of time because I was really able to see that multimodal way of accessing literacy and promoting that love of reading. So what I really want to hear from you is what your thoughts are on the fact that the library, the teacher librarian, how they are so instrumental in fostering that joy, in creating that sense of reading and helping with learning how to read and learning how to read effectively. Please fill us in on your insights about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Rabia, you mentioned engagement, and I think that is such a huge thing in the whole process because it's one thing to be able to decode words on a page. It's another to let them come alive and really see
Mhm.
how they work together and what they do. And I think that's really where the Learning Commons comes into it because it's about finding those texts that really engage students and that they want to be a part of. And sometimes that's where the different types of literacies that can come in and the multimodal stuff can come in, is because those are really hooks to engage the students so that they're willing to jump in with some of the other stuff, or they're willing to take those skills that they've learned and put them to practice and push themselves to use the skills in different ways that they may not have otherwise because they are actually wanting to really get into something that they're interested in. So I think it's giving those opportunities to move beyond, the learning in the classroom is so imperative, it is so important, and then taking it further and realizing, oh, wait, what I learned in my class actually allows me to go somewhere else and to do something else. And I think that that's where the teacher librarian in the library gets to really, that learning commons idea is kind of like magic because that's where it
Mhm.
allows students to take those base ideas that they've got and say, wait a second, I'm interested in this. Oh, wait, but this isn't working. This isn't giving me what I want. Let me try this instead. And really putting those skills to the test and finding out how to use those skills effectively, building the critical literacy with students to be able to take what they're reading, understand it, interpret it, and then know what to do next. And, really building those skills in our students where they can talk to each other about it too. All of those global competencies like the collaboration, the communication, and all of those things. Again, building on that foundation of what they're getting in the classroom, learning the skills about how to read and taking that, and then putting them in a space where they get to use it in a different way so that they really have to dig deep into that learning and they have to apply it. And hopefully seeing all that magic happen then is what I love the most.
Amazing. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about how students, when you ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? So many of them will be like, I want to be an influencer, or I want to be a YouTuber, or I want to have a YouTube channel and I want to
Mhm.
become famous and make tons of money.
Mhm.
It's really hard to do that. And something that content creators are really exceptional at, or really the really good ones are really exceptional at, is taking that engagement of their learning. They're taking that learning and they're turning it into a different mode of showing their learning. So, they're flipping around their education to say, I can take what I have learned and use it to create something new. And that's not an easy task. It's actually quite difficult, but it does require a lot of the things that we have been talking about: the engagement, the joy, the criticality, and that real sense of taking something that you have learned and repurposing it to create meaningful content. And that's such a beautiful thing, and it's so incredible when we can watch that happen in a learning common space. And it's beautiful to watch students do it because they are so into it, and the learning that they are doing is so beyond what they could get from a textbook or from hearing a teacher talk to them for an hour at a time. So it's absolutely magnificent that you highlighted that. Rabia, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, just hearing you talk, I think it's really beautiful that Christie mentioned that, like, um, students learn all of these like skills in the classroom, and then like the learning commons is sort of like this extension of the classroom. And I feel like that's like really important to remember, is that the library is like part of the library is part of all of these different classrooms, and it's really a place where you can kind of like stretch your learning, like Christy mentioned, is like really stretch your learning and put it into like different formats, I guess, and just really experiment with maybe some of the foundational elements that you might have learned. And I think the library provides this like space and opportunity to just kind of be like more free, if that makes sense, just to sort of like experiment and really create, which I think is really something beautiful. And I think it goes back to what you're saying, Pav, where it's like there is this whole movement of like students really wanting to create content. And I think the library is very much connected to that, like making or like creating, like being innovative. So I think that really speaks to like the flexibility of what a learning commons can be and how it promotes all of these like important skills.
I think it's also really imperative to draw the parallels to learning common spaces that are being created in the city and other places around our communities, not just within schools. But if you walk into any public library, any especially newer ones or ones that are being renovated and redone, there's content creation spaces, there's making spaces in all of these facilities now, because this is what is needed. This is what people use the space for. It's not what I remember the library being, as a space where you go and you read books, and sometimes you read newspapers and magazines, and you read, XYZ. Now it's consuming content in its multitude of forms that exist, that are coming from all places around the world, connecting ourselves digitally with globally with other people, other institutions, other libraries, and consuming that content in a variety of different ways. And so why shouldn't our schools be creating those kinds of spaces to support that? Because that is what is existing and in the real world. And when we talk about, we're getting kids ready for the jobs that don't exist yet, or we're getting kids ready for the workspace, how are we doing that if we continue to keep cutting the resources that are in that library space? You're seeing that these are the things that are being created in our communities. This is what we expect from our workforce, is to be able to access all of these different modes of learning, different modes of content that exist, but we don't support it fully in the schools. We've seen the teacher librarian go from a full-time position in schools to a half-time, if not less than half-time. And I don't really know how teacher librarian can be an instructional leader and someone who creates this kind of a functional space for all the students in the school with half time or less. So,
Mhm.
I'd love to hear from you both. How do you feel about that? And how would you advocate for that sort of increase of funding in order to fully have a fully allocated teacher librarian and a 100% functional space from morning till the end of the day? Either of you, I'll open it up to whoever would like to start.
I can go ahead if that's okay. I mean, I think it's a hard question for a start because I
Mhm.
feel like we are not the only people being cut back.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like it really takes a village in a school. We've touched on the fact of teacher librarians as leaders and the role that we play in that. And I think we really do play a valuable role there. I think we have a role to play between connecting classrooms and connecting teachers sometimes. Often I find that I end up really working a lot with some of our newer teachers because they often need different supports or supports and access to resources that maybe they haven't built up over time. And so there's a lot of support that happens that way too. So I think when we look at it just beyond our students, the teacher librarian also has a really big role to play in supporting our teachers. And supporting and co teaching and co planning with classroom teachers is a huge thing, too. We
Mm-hmm.
are noticing that classroom teachers have more and more piled onto their plates. The classes are more diverse. There's a wider range of needs, a wider range of learning styles, which is all a great thing when you have the support to make it work.
Right. Right.
And I think a lot of our classroom teachers are finding that they maybe don't have the extra supports to deal with the extra things thrown in. And there's a large number of students in there to try and help and work with and teach all at the same time. So I think that's one space where, teacher librarians are really imperative to helping things. And we can take on some of those roles for the classroom teacher, help them with resources. They can bring the class in, we can co-teach and co-plan. And that's when, a lot of great things can really happen. So I think we've got to realize that teacher librarians are not just checking out books. We're not
Mm-hmm.
shelving books. In fact, none of my day pretty well includes shelving books for the most part.
Right.
But what we are doing is we are really working as support to become that village that helps our students to succeed to the best possible. And often that requires helping our staff as well as our students because we know that other supportive rules have also been taken out. Um, and at the end of the day, it really does take that village to make it happen. And I know one problem that we've had that I know is not unique in my school at all is often the teacher librarian is also the first to get pulled to cover a class if
Mm-hmm.
there's no supply teacher. So that point 0.5 rule is even questionable at that. I don't feel like I've had a full 0.5 in there this year. And nobody's fault. We need to take care of kids first. Safety is first priority, and it makes perfect sense. So I think it's really important to consider all the variety of roles that the teacher librarian plays and how that enables the rest of the school to really make sure that our students get the best experience possible.
Thank you, Christy, for all of that. I think that you're absolutely right with the fact that the teacher librarian does play a lot of roles and oftentimes a lot of roles that have also been removed from the school community because of funding cuts continuing to happen. And 100% agree with you that the classroom teacher just continues to get more and more piled on. And you've got the teacher librarian often just becomes that floating body to sort of help everybody out. And I don't know how, I mean, it's a noble thing and it's a wonderful thing. And I know that so many teacher librarians, including yourself, do it so well. But it does become burdensome and it becomes very difficult to sustain that. And that is something, as you mentioned, you're very rarely, holding on to even a 0.5 in your learning community. Whereas this is happening everywhere. It's not just isolated to the school that you're in. This is happening in every school, and it's not just the teacher librarian, it's every support staff that is in the school to cover those needs. And I don't know that the general public really knows that is the day to day that is happening all the time. It's not just at the end of the school year, when supply teachers are starting to dwindle and people are, off quite a bit, it's happening all year round. And these are vital experiences for student growth and learning that are constantly being shifted and moved, and neglected, to be honest. And we can't continue with that way. I mean, we need to have a fully functioning library space, ideally a full-time librarian, and somebody who can sustain all of these needs that are in the library space. Rabia, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm listening to you both, and I think you've both really like said everything that I was thinking so beautifully. And I think, I think part of, like, I feel like we need to advocate, I guess, but I feel like that when we need to advocate, it has to be like multidimensional. Like, we have to kind of get like families, communities, teachers, like all stakeholders. And I think for me, when I think about that, I think part of it is maybe creating like visibility around like our role. And so for me, I feel like it's always been about maybe wherever I have a little bit of like space to like show like the multi-dimensional role of the teacher librarian, whether it's on social media or whether it's just, in conversation, in the different spaces that we end up. And I think that visibility and that documentation piece is really important because I think it shows, I guess. I know it's really important to talk about it, but I feel like the documentation piece in different ways, in different capacities, also like shows like all of this like amazing and beautiful work that teacher librarians really do in a school community. And so um I think like the documentation, visibility, and just getting like, I think then hopefully that will create more like folks will know like what this like role really entails. And I hope that like more, funding, and we can advocate more for it. And I feel like even building like I guess solidarity or like community with like other teacher librarians helps, because it kind of helps us sort of like do this work together, because oftentimes we can feel a little bit isolated in our role. We're kind of like the only ones in our school community, and I think just building that community helps us just verbalize or like, vocalize some of the challenges or some of the great things that we're going through. And I think through community, we can kind of like advocate more, and we can, really get our voices heard. So I think those have been sort of ways that I've been like thinking around like how can we build, I guess, like more capacity around various stakeholders really knowing like what we do like day in and day out, and how, as Christie mentioned, like we are like part of that village, and we want our students to get like a comprehensive experience in their schooling, experience. And so how can we continue, I guess, advocating more in the different spaces that we occupy, whether it's like a blog post or even talking to other teachers who can be like our allies as well in the school community, who can really advocate for the role. And I feel like all of those like relationships or those like inter connections really can help us really advocate and really create like continued visibility around this role and how much it impacts students.
Um, I'd love to hear from you, Rabia. I think that what you said about the visibility and documentation is critical. I think it's very important for those that are listening to be in solidarity with teacher librarians, but also with the other support roles that are continuously being cut and that we need to advocate more for. What does
Mhm.
that documentation and visibility look like? You mentioned a blog post. What are some of the other
Mhm.
ways that you have seen or that you think that could be helpful in creating that visibility and documentation? Because I think it's crucial. I think it's critical. I think that what we're doing right now is documenting a lot
Mhm.
of the ways that teacher librarians are crucial to the school communities. What are some of the things that you have seen or that you have done or things that you can think of that may help with that visibility?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I guess it'll look different in different like spaces and different settings. I think just from my own experience, like social media has been a way for me to sort of like document what I've done. But when I was in a school community, also having like a bulletin board that was like accessible for this community, like the families, just to know like what we're doing, how we're doing it, was very important. And then just, maybe writing articles or like just creating more visibility in the spaces that maybe I have a little bit of space in. So I guess it'll look different based on like what everyone is comfortable with. But I guess just creating a little bit more like visibility around that.
Christie, you had something to add?
Yeah, just to add into the visibility piece, I think, one thing I found really successful this year is running a few special events and things. So we've recently just done a book exchange. Students brought in books from home that they were ready to part with, and then new students could pick those up and take them home for summer reading. Just the book joy that came out of the students on it, but also between asking parents and families to send in books they were finished with, the students bringing in new books they could keep. It really raised a lot of parent support in a way because they kind of knew what was going on. And then we also had volunteers coming in to help organize the exchange and being there to help the students choose books. So I think events like that, I think Forest of Reading is another great event that also, during that time, students work to read a list of 10 Canadian books. But again, sort of advertising those things to the community too, they start to realize, oh, wait a second, this person is adding something extra to the experience. And I think things like that can help too with the visibility piece.
Yeah, and as well as just having multiple opportunities to bring the community in, and look around, having open houses. You've got a new podcast studio in the library, or you've got some new robots, or you've got you've just installed your new green screen, and just inviting the community in to take a look. This is what's happening in the learning commons space, and that way they can really see what you as the teacher librarian are doing, on a day-to-day basis as well. So thank you for highlighting some of those incredible ways to increase visibility and to document what's happening in the learning commons space. As we wrap up this interview, and it's been such a great one talking about the role of the teacher librarian and the learning commons space, I'd love to hear maybe what is your dream next step for the library learning common space, or as somebody who has this love of learning, love of reading, what would you love to see happen for the learning commons, the library learning common space, or for teacher librarians? And if you have any other last words to sort of take us out in this great insightful conversation, please share that as well. Rabia, I'm going to start with you. What would you love to see happen within the library learning commons space or with teacher librarians? And if you have any last words or thoughts to take us out of the conversation, please share.
Yeah. Go. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it was like such a great conversation. It was like an honor to just talk with you both. I think what I would I guess my last words would just really be to kind of like continue to like build visibility and respect and honor in relation to the teacher librarian role. And also just, I guess, like a continued love and respect for the school learning commons, and recognizing that, you know, a school library learning commons can't necessarily function without like a trained and intentional teacher librarian. Like if we want the space, we need the person who's kind of like helping to facilitate that space. So I think I would just continue to like say that like whatever position we're in or whatever space we occupy, to continue like advocating for that, because it really impacts our students, and all of our students should have the best experiences in their schooling experience.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Rabia. And Christy, what are your last words and thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, what I'd really love to see for school libraries is just to be that thriving sort of heart of the community in the school. A space where students can come to chill and think of new ideas at the end of a, long day of learning. A space where they can come to be energized and just, be able to delve into those things that they touched on in their class that they really want to know more about, or something they didn't get to talk about in their class and they really want to learn about it. And just build that community where students can learn, where they have the space where they can have their voice, they have choices, and they can really, access somebody who is there to work with them and to bring out their voices and to teach them that, we really are there to listen and work with them, and building that space in the community and in the school to really help our students thrive.
Thank you, Christie. Just as you were speaking, I was reminded of another thing that perhaps we didn't think so much about, but or even talk about today. But that option of having the alternative space from within the classroom when you need to remove yourself, or you need to go somewhere just to gather your thoughts. We've placed a huge emphasis on mental health and well-being for our students in our school communities, and if you really want to actualize what that looks like in a school community, having an alternative space for students to go to when they need to take that break is one of those actual ways. It's a way that we can practice mental health and well-being in schools. And so when we remove the supervision from that space, or we remove the ability for students to go there when they need to go there, that's detrimental to students. And so as a last thought, thank you so much for highlighting that point. Rabia, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts as well. And I want to thank both of you for being guests on Teacher Talk and ETT Podcast this evening. Please share and please pass on the podcast to everybody who is listening, and to your colleagues as well. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to get to know some of the different supports that are out there in the school community that we don't often get the privilege to hear about as much. So once again, Christie, Rabia, thank you so much for joining us on Teacher Talk and ETT Podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of Teacher Talk, an ETT podcast production. We hope you enjoyed this insightful discussion. We'd like to remind you to rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps us reach more educators like yourself. Don't forget to visit our website at ett.ca. There, you'll find additional information and resources from ETT. The ideas and opinions shared on this podcast are our own and do not represent the viewpoint of any organization. We aim to provide a platform for open dialogue and thought-provoking conversations. If you have any topics you'd like us to cover or any questions you'd like us to address in future episodes, feel free to reach out to us on social media or email teachertalk@ett.on.ca. We love hearing from our community. Teacher Talk is a Chey and Pav educational services production where we strive to bring you the best educational production and professional development. You can connect with us at cheyandpav.com for all your podcasting needs. Until next time, keep inspiring, keep teaching, and keep making a difference in the lives of your students.